Hello, everyone. It's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to the Development Hell podcast and the reconvening of the Movie Club. Here this month, we're going to be talking about Clint Eastwood's Best Picture winning Western, his last traditional Western, Unforgiven. And we got Jim, we got Kevin, we got Joe, and me to talk about it this episode. And before we give everybody a chance to jump on in and give their thoughts, I gotta give a little backstory to this particular film, which this was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, won 4 of them. It won Best Picture and Best Director for Clint Eastwood. So Clint Eastwood won 2 Oscars for this movie. He lost a third to Al Pacino for Scent of a Woman. Hoo-ha! Yabba dabba doo. Which in hindsight's kind of ridiculous, but that performance is still a lot of fun. It also won Best Supporting Actor for Gene Hackman and Editing for Joel Cox. So this was a highly praised film. It made $170 million on a $14 million budget. So this was a ginormous hit. And this is indeed the last traditional Western that Clint Eastwood has done. He's done a couple of like neo-Westerns like Cry Macho, but like he has not returned to the actual like pure Western genre since then. And what was interesting is this film was dating back to, this was written back in like 1976. And Francis Ford Coppola originally was going to make the film, but couldn't find the money to finance it. That sounds familiar. Unfortunately for Francis Ford Coppola, it's a tough job trying to self-finance all your movies with your own production studio. But David Webb Peoples did write the script, and it got to Clint Eastwood in the early 1980s. And at that point, he thought he needed to do some other films first and also kind of age in to the role, because William Money is an aging outlaw. So like at that point, Clint Eastwood was, how old would have Clint Eastwood been in the early 80s? Like 40. So he needed to wait a little bit longer, and then he wound up. And a fun little anecdote, he personally called Richard Harris to star in the film as English Bob, and apparently he was watching High Plains Drifter at the time and thought somebody was pulling a prank on him. So he's literally watching a Clint Eastwood movie when Clint Eastwood called him. So he thought somebody was messing with him, but no, it was actually Clint Eastwood. And I'm just imagining, I was like, well, how's it going, Richard? You want to be in my movie? So, and there you go, Vinny. Vinny wanted to know if anybody was going to do a Clint Eastwood impression. But there's some backstory, which I always thought this was very interesting. But in the mortal words of Clint Eastwood as a director, well, let's go. So, Jim, what are your general thoughts on Unforgiven?
First time viewer of Unforgiven somehow. I'm not really sure how I missed it for so long. I knew it by reputation as being like the gritty Western, like the different Western. After seeing it, it kind of makes sense as to why Clint Eastwood would want to make this punctuation mark on his. I mean, he kind of made his career on Westerns, right?
Yeah.
So I get it. I went back to taking notes this time, and I really enjoyed how the themes were there, and then they kept popping up again. It wasn't like all the time hitting you over the head with it, but it would come back in surprising ways. So I've got guilt and innocence. I've got big and little, especially when it comes to dick size, because let's be honest, this movie's about dick size.
There's a lot of dick measuring contests in this movie. And there's
then
always a bigger dick.
There's always a bigger one. Little Bill obviously thinks he's got the biggest complex out of everybody, but yeah, I really liked it. I liked it. The last thing I had written down for themes was value. Like, what is the value of a horse, of a whore, of a horse face, of a man, and especially like a life? Like, what is the value of a human life? So I didn't know this movie won so many awards, but I really enjoyed it.
It's interesting because it won like very specific, like big awards. Like it wasn't like a won 10 Academy Awards kind of movie, but won the ones that counted. Kevin, what are your general thoughts on Unforgiven?
Yeah, so this was my first time seeing this movie too. So like Jim mentioned, I like the themes it touches on. I think the main theme of the movie was probably guilt. Um, I enjoyed it from start to finish. I didn't really know what to expect out of this. I actually haven't even seen any other Clint Eastwood's westerns, but you know I do know he built his career on those, obviously.
Mhm.
Um, and it did seem like that was probably an influence when he made this movie. It seems like there was a lot of self-reflection going on in the character, and maybe that was had something to do with him self-reflecting on his own career. But I enjoyed the build up to the that confrontation at the end of the movie. Gene Hackman was a delightful villain. I thought I didn't know what to think of him at first. Um, my first thought was, okay, he's a little rough, but he's taking care of his town. He got it seemed more and more evil as the movie went on until finally I was happy to see him die. It was a blast. I like how they didn't really hold back when it showed the brutality of killing another human being, taking their life. They kind of drilled that in. I enjoyed it.
How about you, Joe?
So, first time viewer of this movie, similar to what everybody else had to say. Unfortunately, haven't had a chance to watch the Man with No Name trilogy, so I really don't have much of a backing to really go off of. But I mean, overall, pretty much similar. I mean, Unforgiven is a very appropriate title for this film, just in the sense that it's about, I mean, just from the get-go, Will's character is that he's done this horrible thing and he lives with that throughout his whole life. It becomes a cliche, an archetype that we, use a lot in movies, and it's not new here. It's not new when it's being used again, but it's still a very good archetype when it comes to establishing an anti-hero that it allows us to really root for. And like Kevin said earlier about the Gene Hackman's character, I felt like his at first it was like moral ambiguity, like you're not sure if he's good or bad, like protecting it down. Like even the fact that, you kind of really sit with it at the start of the film where, they're like, you're not gonna like hang these guys, right? You're not gonna, do this serious for what they did to the girl. He's like, we make an example and that's about it, sell some horses or whatever. But like as it gets on, you realize that he's a bit of a, he's a bit of a dick.
Which, so for me, this was the fifth time I think that I watched this film. So this is one of this is in like my top 25 favorite movies of all time. So like I love this movie. And I was very excited that we were going to get a chance to talk about this because this is the most perfect example of what a revisionist Western is. Because yeah, so one other bit of thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning is that Clint Eastwood dedicated this film to Sergio Leone and Don Siegel, who were the two directors that helped shape his career. So, like, Leone did the Dollars trilogy, the Man with No Name trilogy. Don Siegel was the one who made Dirty Harry, The Beguiled. And basically, if you look at Clint Eastwood's directorial style, it's kind of a mix of both. So like he learned a lot of lessons from both of them. This feels like if Don Siegel made a Western. It's so gritty, but the thing is it never shies away from capturing just the stark beauty of the Western landscape and stuff like that. But this movie is dark. Like you're not seeing these beautiful vistas like in a John Ford Western and stuff like that. It isn't hyper stylized like a spaghetti Western like Leone. It is dark. It is gritty. There's a lot of scenes at night. There's a lot of scenes in the rain. There's just a darkness looming over this film because this film deconstructs all the mythology that we know of Westerns. Because the thing is, like, Clint Eastwood started on Rawhide, I think it was. So, like, he started on a TV Western. He was in the Dollars trilogy. He made High Plains Drifter, Outlaw Josie Wales, Pale Rider, Hang 'em High. Like, he made all these Westerns. And leading up to this point, there are certain things that we expect out of Westerns, like fanning guns and shooting people really quick. What I love so much about this film is it calls bullshit on all the, like, this is what a movie Western is, and like this is what actual life back then was like. Like, you're not going to be able to just like quickly like bam 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 and shoot 20 guys. Like, guns were pieces of crap back then. They didn't work like that. And like the fact that like you actually had to like take your time to try to shoot somebody and actually make things work. And there's so much gray area in this film, so much gray area. And like with Little Bill Daggett, he like, I feel like he starts at lawful neutral, where it's like he's the law is the law, it doesn't matter. And as the film goes on, he's 100% lawful evil because he's just leveraging that to do horrible things. I love the English Bob character because he is the representation of what a gunslinger from like a movie is. And in the end, he's just the duck of death, which it's commentary. This film's commentary on journalism and the news is fascinating too, which I don't think you would expect to hear in a movie like this. I love Morgan Freeman. Apparently, Morgan Freeman's favorite director to work with is Clint Eastwood. So, like, and you can feel that, like, they have a really good rapport with each other. Gene Hackman isn't like a big, boisterous villain. He's just cold. And, like, it's so interesting. And Clint Eastwood, I think this and Million Dollar Baby are probably his two best performances in his career because Million Dollar Baby has the emotion and this film has the complexity because there's something about the man we see Bill Money is at the beginning of this film and the tension that Eastwood as a director builds up till we get Money at the end of the movie. So like it reminds me of like Godzilla, of like that kind of thing where it's just like you get a slow burn and you know there's a monster here, but we don't get to quite see it until the whole film blows off at the end. Which also, the scene in the bar at the end of the movie is one of my favorite scenes in the history of cinema. It is so vicious. And I think Clint Eastwood as William Money in that scene is one of the scariest characters you'll ever see in movies because he is a force of vengeance and he's not going to stop. And he, like how he cold-heartedly just shoots the bartender and just out of nowhere, just bam. And how he scares off like 3/4 of the town. And it's just, and there's so many great quotes that link so deeply to these themes. So like, so the last two things I'm going to say before we kind of like open up the discussion, there's two quotes in this movie that I absolutely love. When the young man finally kills somebody and has to reflect on it. And Clint and Will Money says, something interesting killing a man. You take everything that he's got and everything he's ever gonna have. And it's just like, it's such an interesting way of thinking about like you are destroying somebody and everything that could possibly happen to them in the future, you're taking that from them. And it goes back to what's equality? Like, did they deserve this? Like, was that the right punishment for all of it? And then, it's so great when little Bill is laying there dying. And Will Money standing over him, he's like, I was building a house. I didn't deserve this. And Will Money's just like, deserves ain't got nothing to do with it. And it's just like, that is cold. And that's so true about life because things happen to people that don't deserve it but that's just how life is. So obviously, I love this movie. Quick question for everybody: we bringing Will Money to Applebee's?
I think he'd have a lot to share. Had some interesting stories.
I feel like he'd sit there like Roy Kent and just growl and drink black coffee and not eat again.
Which I feel like him at the beginning of the movie is one thing. Him at the end of the movie, I would not want to be any. I don't even want to be in the same town as him. Like, I would have been out of town at the end of the movie because I would not want to mess with him. How about Ned? Would you bring Ned to Applebee's?
Oh, for sure. Is that Morgan Freeman's character?
Morgan Freeman's character.
Right.
Absolutely.
That Ned's one of those characters that did not. So like, deserves got nothing to do with it. Ned's like that character from this movie that got a punishment way more serious than he ever deserved. But I guess, what are some of the things that, I guess, let's start with some of these themes and these ideas, and like, what do you think of some of the ways that this film kind of deconstructs expectations when it comes to Westerns and stuff like that?
So I guess we can start with Will's character in the first place and how they introduce him. I thought it was a nice choice to show throughout the movie. I mean, it keeps coming up how, he had this outlaw lifestyle, and he gave it up essentially for his wife. He said, I gave up the drink, I gave up the killing. And it kind of creeps back throughout the movie. I guess I wasn't expecting as much of a morality study in this movie, and I really like the way they handled that through his character. And actually, to go back to that line when he kills, what's his name, Gene Hackman's character.
Yeah.
So he says, deserves got nothing to do with it. And I thought that was interesting that he said that, because how that actually read to me is that it's got everything to do with it. He made it personal by the end of the movie, and he knows that he's transformed back into this killer. That's kind of how I read that line. And I just enjoyed seeing that transformation. I thought that was a smart way to do that character arc for him.
Yeah.
I
Go
feel
ahead.
like I'd be with Shane on interpretation of that particular line. Because in one of the tropes they do run with in this movie, something that makes it a Western, is that it's the Wild West, right? There's really no law except for the law that you make. And to extend that, there's really no right or wrong except for what you can enforce. So I was with you, Shane, when you were saying how basically bad things happen to good people. Like the guy who is it the first guy that gets killed out of the group? He just went with some coworker to the whorehouse.
Yep.
He seemed like a pretty decent guy. They were having a decent time. His buddy flies off the handle, and now he feels responsible for it, and he tries to fix it, and everything just keeps getting worse. Like,
Which you bring up an interesting point, because if you think about the sex workers in this place, because you have Alice, who basically turns this into a vendetta. She's the leader, but like, I think the young woman who is cut up would have been perfectly happy with that horse. I think she thought it was a sweet gesture, but Alice didn't perceive it that way. And I think that's interesting that you brought up too about it's the laws that we make. It's the expectations and the equity that we make in this film, because so many people get messed up because little Bill thinks he can make sure that nobody has guns except for him. Like, that's his rule. That's what he makes. He is the law in this town, and he loves it. You can tell that he little fascist asshole loves having that control and putting that law upon people. And you're right, that young man of the two of them, he didn't technically do anything. He didn't do that. And he gets lumped into it. And I think what makes this the most revisionist Western is his death scene. Because, like, if this was a John Ford film, they would have heroically rode in and killed them guys like nothing. But it was sad. Like,
That was a
one,
good scene.
it's such a great scene because one, Ned can't finish him. Ned has that breakdown that leads him to leaving in the first place. And then you have a cold-blooded killer like Will Money admitting, I'm not very good with this gun. I'm going to do my best. And he tries to kill him, and he kills him slowly because all he can do is shoot him in the gut. And then he's riling, and him saying, get the kid some water. Like, that whole entire scene plays out in how great this movie is. Because, like, did that kid deserve that? What's the right punishment? And it reminds me of The Godfather. At the beginning of the film, when the Undertaker comes and asks for him to kill these young men that raped his daughter, and when Don Corleone's like, your daughter's still alive. How's this justice? Is that equitable punishment? And I feel like this movie deals with what's equitable punishment so deeply. Because the thing is, it's like, so this one guy cuts up this sex worker. Do they deserve to die? The other sex workers think that they do, pull their money and put a hit out on them. And one of them didn't actually do anything and tried to make it better to the best he could. Because, you know, he's some random kid cowboy that probably doesn't have a whole lot to his name except for some horses. And it's really interesting how that scene all plays out because you feel bad sitting there, and you should, like, in any other Western, you would feel good that they got the bad guy. But that whole scene just feels so sad and uncomfortable to watch.
You know what surprised me about that scene is how I was surprised to feel this myself. There was a sense of relief that Money could follow through and do it. And I still, it's a really complicated emotion. I can't justify it with my head. You know what I mean?
Well, I think
But it's like, it's so disappointing when Morgan Freeman, he's like, I can't do it. You want somebody to be able to pick him up, I guess. But like, yeah, I didn't dislike that kid at all at that point in the movie. I didn't have any personal vendetta against him whatsoever. On that note, if we're gonna just continue with that, like, to me, the whole point of bringing in the British character who kept talking about the Queen and nobility and what was his point? That nobody would shoot the Queen, right? They could shoot a president, but they would never shoot the Queen, right?
Which,
like Little Bill's the king. He's the emperor of this little town. You know, I thought that was kind of cool how they set that up.
Which, I guess, to give context, what year did this take place?
I think it was 1886 or 87. It
So,
was
like,
the 1880s, though.
So, like, Lincoln died, obviously, at this point. And I'm trying to think if any other presidents have been assassinated since then. But, like...
Well, I know Teddy Roosevelt wasn't shot until the 1900s.
Well,
was it Garfield? Was this the immediate aftermath of Garfield? Somebody check my dates here on my phone. That's one downside of doing this on my phone is I don't have like a side piece, you know?
Yeah, let's see. So Lincoln 65, Garfield 81.
Yeah.
And then William McKinley in 1901. So yeah, this is pretty recent after James Garfield was assassinated. So like that's very interesting context to be adding into it. And that's a very interesting point because nobody, like, the only people in this town that question Little Bill is Alice. That's basically it. But she has power over the other sex workers, but she has no other power outside of her own little group. So like she can't really do anything about it, except, paying men to come in and kill these men, which kind of obviously is the whole crux. It's the call to action of the film and leads to, basically the destruction of this town. Because when Will Money rolls into town, most of the most powerful men in this town are dead, and everybody else is scared shitless because if they do anything, he's going to come back and kill their women and children. And I believe them because Clint Eastwood's very scary at the end of this movie.
He is, yeah, and I didn't. Maybe I'll ask you guys. Joe's been very quiet. So, like, to you, that scene where Clint Eastwood, Will Money,
It's going
kills
outside reception, so
okay, the scene where he kills, what was it, 9 or 10 guys in that bar at the end of the movie. Was that a satisfying scene for you, or is that just devastating? Is that the end of The Last of Us to you? Oh, you guys haven't seen The Last of Us yet, have you?
I have
The
not seen that.
show. So
The show,
okay,
I think it's in the video game too, but just
yeah,
be prepared
I've
to
never
like.
played the game, but
I
I
haven't
did
played
get
the
to
game either.
I did get to the end of the first
Bad
season of The
today.
Last of Us. That's an interesting comparison because, and I'm not going to get into the show because I don't want to spoil that for those who haven't seen it, but I feel like it's satisfying that little Bill dies because I feel like it's some kind of spirit of vengeance coming to punish him. But it makes me sad because I was rooting for Will to be a better person through this whole film. And because the thing is, like, he didn't, like, here's the thing, he's a shitty farmer. Like, he's bad. Like, you see that from the very beginning. Like, half his hogs are dead. He's, like, getting thrown around in the mud. He's not good at that. Unfortunately, what Will Money is good at is evil. And he doesn't want to get back to that. And you can tell that through the whole film. And it's almost unbelievable that he's Will Money. Like this specter that's kind of looming over the film. And you're like, no, he's not that guy. He can't possibly be this guy. We've spent this whole movie with him. And that's what's so shattering at the end of the film is when you see him like he used to be. It's like, oh God, he was. And that's scary. Because, like, back to your point at the beginning, Jim, about the dick measuring contests, there's nobody bigger and scarier than Will Money. I can guarantee that in the Old West, in this world, because after what we see at the end of this movie, he is like this looming monolith of like the Wild West. And
I like that you keep comparing him to a force of nature, though. That does let me see the way the movie resolves itself in a slightly different, more satisfying light.
Which that Will Money that comes into town is there to lay judgment upon them. But the thing is, through the whole film, we didn't want to see him get back to that point because he's grown so much and it's really sad. And my hope is that he can pull that back and have that life in San Francisco that the blurb talks about at the end. I don't know. But the thing is, what that tells me is that Will Money's always there. And with the right nudge, he's there and ready to go, which is a terrifying thing. And
right, there's no walking it back.
No, I feel like it's a pretty strong parallel to High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider. That, because I'm not going to get into it because have any of you seen High Plains Drifter?
No.
All I'm
I've
gonna
seen
I
two of the
haven't.
Dollars films, and I've seen Hang 'em High.
okay.
Those are the only westerns I've seen of Eastwood's.
All I'm gonna say is that it is a supernatural western, and leave it at that. And Clint Eastwood's character is very complicated. And the character that he plays in High Plains Drifter could have easily been Will Money. There's an evil to that character and a destruction that he brings. And just kind of wrapping up the point is like, I didn't want to see Will become that Will Money again. But he did. And as a scene, it is incredibly powerful. And just like, oh, look, where he has his double barrel is just like, I'm just going to shoot you, little Bill. And there's like, misfire. And Clint Eastwood doing the best Clint Eastwood he could do, just straight chucks it at him. And, he gets down and he aims everybody else is like, ah, and can't hit the broadside of a barn because that's how actual guns worked back then. And he just straight kills half those guys in there. And it's so interesting. And it kind of leads to the journalist. What a sycophant. He just latches himself, and it's our society, it's our media. We just latch ourselves onto the next big thing. And I think it's a very interesting thing that we chase these tall tales, we chase these stories, and he just keeps latching onto the next big fish. And what I love about it is Will Money doesn't give a shit about that and doesn't want to sit down and tell him his story. That's the ego of Bob and Bill. Will Money didn't do all of those things for the glory. He did them because he was a bad man. And that shows at the end of the movie.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the journalist gets away in the end, right?
Yep.
Yes. I thought
Do you
the
guys think that's
journalist.
significant? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just
Kevin.
thought. Oh, I don't know about that, but I know that the journalist I thought was an interesting addition to the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Because you've been saying, Shane, Will reveals himself to be this big force of nature, and he wasn't doing it for the glory or anything like that. We do get the sense that there were outlaws that did do it for those reasons, like English Bill. And I thought the inclusion of the journalist was kind of interesting because he's following around English Bill until he gets sent away. And then he latches onto the sheriff. He's kind of like it's at this point in history where outlaws are already kind of a thing in the past, or they're starting to be. And he's kind of following that story around. He's following the outlaws, so to speak. And I guess you could include the sheriff in that a little bit. He does turn out to be a villain himself by the end of the movie. So I just thought that was interesting. He's chasing the big stories, the big, there's going to be a big gunfight here by the end of the movie. That's probably why he was sticking around. Who knows if he would have tried to go on to follow Will or someone else after that. I just thought he was a little mousy character.
He's an interesting character. Definitely. I mean, by comparison, he's kind of a little bitch, right? But that's not his trade. His trade is not the trade of Will Money.
He literally pees himself.
Right.
He's a writer,
Try not to get wet when you disarm.
The pen is his sword, right?
Yep.
Was he in this for the money though? Because I feel like all these characters keep making these chivalrous grand gestures, and they don't really care about that sex worker. They just want their reward. They just want the money. Even William Money just wants the money, right? He doesn't do it because he met the girl and he cares about her. Although that was a really sweet scene, I thought.
Yeah,
together.
that was a great scene.
What motivates that journalist? Like maybe, like Shane just said, maybe he represents the media more than he is a journalist with selfish motivations, and that's why William Money rather,
Yeah, he's
Clint
clearly,
Money
publishing
lets him
books and
go.
stuff about it. So I think he's doing it for the story. He's got a paycheck at the end of that trail.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just really feel like he he is certainly more than just a character. Like he does represent like what do we care about? What's going to fill the 24-hour news cycle? We have this obsession with serial killers and outlaws and all kinds of people like this. And what I loved about it is like this might be some interesting reaches here, but like English Bob turns out to be a charlatan. Like it was all tall tales and stuff like that. He did it for the attention. It's like a Charles Manson thing where like he's just living off that. Because like when it really came down, which this is an interesting thing. I don't know if either of you ever watched Mindhunters, but like
Lost Joe.
one of the actual serial killers hates Charles Manson because he's considered one of the greatest serial killers, and he didn't kill anybody himself. He's
Right.
just a person who tells tall tales and convinces people all these things. Bob's a charlatan, but we love the story. We love the glorified story. And then what's interesting is Little Bill's the one who pulls the rug out from under and tells the real story. But you can tell Bill loves telling it.
Oh yeah.
Like he's just eating it up. He loves Beauchamps being there. He loves talking about it. And he's just like Bob. He loves hearing his own crap and talking it up because I can guarantee you, Little Bill was a criminal at one point. He was an outlaw who just did right. I was building a house. I was doing right for myself. But then he was using that power for evil and control and to control people. It's William Money who is the real deal. Like, Will didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for the stories. Like, Will Money was a bastard. Like, he was a drunken, evil human being that killed men, women, and children for the money. And now in that moment, like, the only reason Will reverted back to that was because of Ned.
Right. The moment he takes that sip of whiskey, it's going to go down. They were waiting the whole movie for that.
Yeah.
Yep. Because he takes the bot when he finds out about Ned. Like, Will's not there. Like, he really is a spirit of vengeance in that moment because he's there because of Ned. And he's drawing upon something that he told his wife and that he would never be ever again. And it's scary to see it. And that, like, he doesn't care about somebody writing about a story about that gunfight. And the thing is, there's no fake to Will Money. He really did all those horrible things. And what's fascinating is he doesn't remember most of it. Like when he was asked about it, he's like, I was too drunk to even know what I was doing half the time. I think that's fascinating because he's not living off the high of the glory of it all because he can't even remember most of it. He was just a bad person. And it's fascinating with that journalist character and that scene at the end. Because, like, Jim, what you brought up, that is an amazing scene between him and the young sex worker who's all cut up. Because, like, he's like, you're not ugly like me. And it's like, Will knows that he was a terrible person and did horrible, horrible things. And he doesn't want to relive that. He doesn't want to remember it. He doesn't want to be that again. And that's what makes it even more tragic at the end of the movie that he does get back to that. Whether it's for the quote unquote right reason to defend his friend's honor or not.
Yeah. I found myself expecting him to continue a redemptive arc after, was it because little Bill beat him up? Is that why he was close to death? He was sure he was going to die. And then he wakes up and the girl's there and they have this conversation. And he's having a greater appreciation for like the things around him. It's like he's reborn, right?
Yep.
I was thinking of that scene from The Revenant where Leah wakes up in the belly of that animal. Was it a stag or
Cuts
something?
out like a caribou or something.
Yeah. So that was like, to me, that's what was happening. And that's why I was kind of so disappointed that the movie ended the way it did. You know what I mean? With the shootout. But I do get it, you know. I think my favorite quote, the only quote that I wrote down, maybe it's not my favorite, but after he gets beat up by little Bill, Alice tells him, "You just beat up an innocent man." And he goes, "Innocent of what?" I think that's a great pairing with like, who deserves to die? Like, the deserves has nothing to do with it. Like, everybody's guilty and everybody deserves whatever they get. It is what it is. Like, that's, I don't know, that hit me as very profound.
There's a line where Will goes, "We all have it coming."
Well, because the thing is, it's like that's painting the picture of like we all live our lives, we all do the things that we did, we've all done things. Nobody's perfect. We've all done things that we're probably not happy with. Whether it's like small aggressions against people in our lives, or just random strangers, or you know, the horrible things that Will Money did. But this film is very, what's the right word? I'm trying to think what the right word of. It's just so there's something very raw and just pragmatic about how the world is. And the whole entire film is trying to break down the myth of the Old West. These aren't like John Wayne kind of westerns, like riding off and taking down the bad guys. This is not black and white. The whole entire movie's gray. Everybody's gray. There's very few characters in this movie, like I would argue, like obviously his kids, who we spend like 5 minutes with at the beginning of the film. The young woman who got cut up. But the thing is, even just her profession would not be considered morally right by a lot of people, so she's morally gray just by other people's expectations of what would be morally right or not. And she's punished for what's done to her because nobody values her because of what she does. Like, if that was just a young woman who got cut up on the street in that town, I'm sure Bill would be riding out ready to lynch those men. But no, she's a sex worker, so she had it coming. And that's the despicable thing about it. Besides Bill, I also was happy that the guy who owned the bar and the whorehouse got it too. He was a piece of crap.
Oh, he was a jerk.
Yeah. It's like, basically, it's just like, that's why that scene's so complicated at the end, because it's like, some of them, like, on whatever your morality is, might have really deserved that, because they were horrible human beings causing a lot of harm to people. But did they kill anybody? Bill certainly has at some point. But, like, it's a very interesting, like, that's why this film's so complicated and interesting, because not a lot of Westerns are complicated like this. Especially, like, a lot of, like, John Ford Westerns and Howard Hawks Westerns. It's like, it's really easy to pick out the good guy. And
do you think that Eastwood had a lot of Ford tropes or films in mind, and he was consciously kind of what was the word you used earlier? Deconstructing them.
Yeah.
Do you think that was part of his process here?
What's interesting, because, like, very few I don't think Clint Eastwood has a writing credit on most of his films. But here's the thing. I know Clint Eastwood's process as a director is to rewrite the scripts and make them his movies. So, like, he might not have a writing credit on here because it wasn't officially deemed worthy by the Writers Guild, but like I know like his process is to go through and rewrite things. So like I have a sinking feeling he had specific ideas that he wanted to deconstruct because like what are the most sensationalized westerns? Spaghetti westerns. There's trick shots or these crazy over the top fantastical things that go on in those movies. Like fanning weapons is so common in spaghetti westerns because everybody's like quick gun, shoot everybody. And I think Clint Eastwood, who obviously had so much respect for Sergio Leone, but I really feel like there's a lot of Don Siegel here because have either of you watched Dirty Harry?
I've seen Dirty Harry. I don't know if I've seen any of that guy's other movies.
It's a complicated movie. There is no black and white in that. Like, obviously, the antagonist of the movie is a serial killer, so obviously evil. But the thing is, Harry's not like
A good
it's
guy.
interesting. It's one of those things where it's like most people probably think what it means by dirty Harry is that he's a dirty cop. Harry's not a dirty cop. Harry is somebody who pushes the limits of what he's supposed to do as a cop. So like he's not on the take, he's not doing illegal acts and using his job as a police officer to do they call him Dirty Harry because he does the dirty jobs that nobody else wants to get caught up in. And this Unforgiven is a dirty film in terms of like this is not clean cut. Nothing is easy to process in it. Everybody has complexities. Everybody is struggling with the morality of what they're trying to do. And I feel like I don't know if either of you have even heard of The Beguiled, but that is a messed up, uncomfortable Civil War film.
Is that a Don Siegel movie?
Yep. Huh. I think it came out shortly after Dirty Harry, but like Clint Eastwood's character in that is so complicated. And like he is playing everyone, and there's like it's really hard to read where he really lies and what he's doing. It's interesting because Sofia Coppola remade it with Nicole Kidman and Colin Farrell back in like I think 2018, I think it was.
Oh
like
man, I was thinking Will Ferrell for a second. That was a little weird.
That would have been an interesting twist. Now Colin Farrell. But I feel like there's a lot of Don Siegel here because Don Siegel is very much a 70s filmmaker. 70s cinema was a very specific time. And I'm glad this movie wasn't made in the 80s because this is not an 80s film. Like, it just doesn't fit into like 80s filmmaking. And I feel like the 90s there's like certain things that are like super 90s, you know, like Clueless and stuff like that in that kind of way. But I feel like this film, I think this film's timeless. Like, this is a very specific thing that's trying to reconfigure people's perspectives on Westerns. Because how hard would it be to make a traditional Western today?
The way they shot it was definitely very classic, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. It's very true. Like this has incredible cinematography. I love those shots when they have the text on the screen. Like those are beautiful shots of like the landscape and stuff like that. And that scene where Will's talking to the cut up sex worker, that young woman, the shots of the mountains with the snow and everything is just absolutely gorgeous. But I think it's really hard thematically to make a classic Western, like a traditional Western today, because I don't think 2023 audiences would buy it. Like, I don't think we would buy into the easy, clean cut. These are purely good guys trying to take down these purely bad outlaws. Because if I can think of all the even neo-Westerns and westerns that I know I've seen in the past, like 20 that have come out in the past 20 something years, not many of them are like traditional, easy, clean cut kind of westerns. You have things like The Proposition, which is what's called a meat pie western. It's an Australian western. Got names for everything. Even the remake of 310 to Yuma from James Mangold, like you're rooting for a criminal a lot of the time, like Russell Crowe's character. Ben Foster's character's a piece of shit. But like Russell Crowe's like, he's a bad guy. But is he really a bad guy? Do we want to see him go to prison? Stuff like that. And especially neo-westerns like No Country for Old Men. That's like the most nihilistic shit you're gonna find. Because Cormac McCarthy. But I
R.I.P.
R.I.P. But I do think like this was a perfect time to release this film because this was an end of an era. Westerns have not been a big part of cinema since then, and this was actually only the third Western ever to win Best Picture.
The Searchers would have been one.
Mm-mm.
And no Stagecoach.
No, John Ford. Did he direct? It was Cimarron in 1931 and Dances with Wolves in 1990. One Best Picture.
Interesting that the last two were so close together.
Mm-hmm. Which I think a lot of people could make the argument that Dances with Wolves probably shouldn't have won Best Picture.
I haven't seen it yet.
Goodfellas in the same year. But like I think like this was probably an easy pick for Best Picture.
It won it, you said, right?
What year did this come out? Was this 92?
92, yeah.
Yeah, because like this is such a complicated film. And what's so fascinating is like it made so much money. And it's not like a feel-good kind of movie to go out and enjoy. But you know what? That's the star power Clint Eastwood. Up until COVID, every single one of his movies have been bankable for the most part. Like, American Sniper was the highest grossing film of 2013, beating Catching Fire, the Hunger Games movie, and Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, that's how much Clint Eastwood would sell. And it's such a fascinating film. But do either of you have any other specific things that you wanted to talk about in terms of the film?
Yes. So actually, going back to what's his name, Bill, Little Bill. I like how they used him in the movie. One thing I felt is that his presence is kind of what was the catalyst for everyone else in the movie to kind of show their true colors. I really like the scene where they're at the sheriff's station, and he's got English Bill locked up, and the reporter, what was his name, the writer?
Shanks, I think it was.
But he's got him, and he's got him out of his cell, and they're going over the inaccuracies, so to speak, in his story that he's written about Bill.
Shot himself in the foot.
Right. And it kind of escalates to the point where he hands him a gun. He says, all you got to do is pull the trigger. And it gets to the point where he said, can I give it to Bill? He says, go ahead. That scene kind of reveals Bill to be a coward.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the sheriff's actions throughout the movie reveal Will to be the killer that he is. He breaks him out of his hibernation, so to speak. He ends up sending Bill away from his actions. He gets Ned killed. I just thought it was interesting how he was the catalyst for everything in the movie.
That's a really interesting perspective because I didn't think about it that way. But yeah, in that moment, English Bob really shows like he is not the gunslinger that people thinks he is, and he is a coward. It's W.W. Beauchamp is the writer, and that moment, that's such a flex that Little Bill did. Like, yeah, hand it to him. Like
That was fun.
that. It's just like I think he read Bob and played him like a fiddle. And it was a bold choice, Cotton.
Bob, I think I called it Bill.
It's tricky having main characters named Bob and Bill and Will. Like, who wrote this script?
I was keeping track of it during the movie. I keep mixing their names up now that I'm talking about them.
Will Money, though, is such a great name. Like, that just is like, that's a Western character name right there. But yeah, what's interesting is it wasn't Little Bill's initial actions towards Will
Right.
that triggered it, right? Because he beat the shit out of him. And you would have expected, like in any other Western, you would have expected him to go back for vengeance after that.
I think he knows it's part of the job.
Well, yeah, and Will was he was sick and in a horrible state at that point when he was just like sitting there at that table. What I find interesting is even Little Bill underestimated Will Money. Because I think Little Bill has this complex that he's the biggest fish out there and everybody else is just a fraud and a charlatan. And he's the real power because he even said it's just like he was not intimidated enough of Will Money when he walked into that bar at the end, which also great. When they're all standing there planning and he just strolls right in and just shows up like nobody's business. But even Bill is like, when you kill me, then I'll shoot you dead. And like he's acting all confident. But then we did see Bill's real colors when he was down on the ground and Will was standing over him with the gun and he was just like processing through his head. It's like, this is not how it was supposed to go. Like I had a house and going back to, I didn't deserve this and deserves got nothing to do with it. And he just coldly just shoots him. And that was his fate at that point. But it's so fascinating because it wasn't him beating up Will that pushed him to that point. It was his killing his friend. And maybe on some level, that's how Will Money is different. Is he got pushed to that place. Like that wasn't his initial selfish reaction because I feel like if he was a younger man, that Will Money would have came back for Little Bill after he beat him up. But it's not only did he lead to the death of his friend, but he had his dead body sitting in that coffin on display with unbelievable disrespect. And I feel like it's interesting that it took that to get Will to show his true colors. When I feel like there could have been other moments earlier in the film.
Made it very personal for him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's simple enough to say like that anybody has true colors in this movie. Like
everybody's
it's a very gray movie, yeah.
Very gray. I read 2 reviews about this movie after because I kind of was aware that it was supposed to be a landmark Western. And I wanted to kind of know what the critics had to say about it. So I remember one of them was Siskel and Ebert, or I guess just Roger Ebert at that point, maybe. And he didn't like the movie. I guess he kind of missed it. Didn't connect with him. And the other review I read said that Little Bill was the closest thing to a good guy that the movie has. And I was like, that's not how I saw him at all. But like, I suppose if you're looking at somebody who stands for law and order and is tough enough to actually back it up, I guess he is that, like he is, at least he's got some true grit, if you will. Little Bill does. But I found his his big dick power trip to be really tiresome. Actually, I was happy to see him go by the end of
He
the
was
movie.
very arrogant. Like he kept showing up into town when he was called upon, and then he would go off back to his house to do his own thing, right?
And do a really shitty job of putting his house together.
Right, right. And he was very
Which-
brutal when he would come into town, but then he's, oh, I get to go back and live my quaint life in my
Which-
house that I'm building.
That's an interesting parallel for him and Will, is that they're both really bad at trying to just be regular people.
Yeah, right.
And what Bill does instead is he gets power, which he leverages to continue to be the man that he was. I can guarantee you he is very similar as an outlaw as he is as a sheriff. Like, that's the vibe that I get, is that he has that same kind of arrogance, that same kind of brutality about him. And that's why I disagree with that review as well, of like, he does have grit and he does stick to his guns, but they're malicious. And he's using his power and authority for control, and not because, like, if he was a good person, he would have done something about those two, like the guy that cut up.
He had all their backs. He was on their side essentially. We find
Yeah.
out by the end of the movie.
So, like,
Yeah, and that's what kicks this whole up, isn't it? He had a chance to do the right thing,
Right, but he just does.
and he didn't. Yeah.
similar to the movie Do the Right Thing, nobody does the right thing in this movie. And I think that's the point, is that nobody acts like there wouldn't have, if they punished the man that did that, there would be no movie. But it's Bill's actions of inaction that leads to this whole entire situation.
It's a good point. It's like it seems like no one really acts until it's too late in this movie. And then it
Yeah,
goes.
but I
over
mean,
the
you did
edge.
kind of point that out, Kevin, didn't you? Like you were saying he's kind of the central
Yeah.
character that kind of makes everything happen. Character development, what we see in the characters, the plot moves along because of what he does. So, yeah, even though I mean, obviously this movie's about Clint Eastwood, right? But maybe because Little Bill, like you said, they're kind of the same person in many ways. Maybe that's why the character was so important.
He's a good way to frame everything, I guess, with this story.
Well, and it's interesting because, like, this is the first time I've had this thought after watching this movie like 5 times. But, like, obviously Gene Hackman won for Best Supporting Actor
Oh, he did. Okay.
for this movie. Is he really a supporting actor? Because if you really take a step back, they spend so much time with him separately. And a lot of this film is a parallel of Will and Bill.
Yeah.
Which, that has to be done on purpose too, that they have the same name. They're both Williams. It's just one mostly goes by Will, and the other goes by Little Bill. But they both go on an arc. I feel like Little Bill's is his reckoning. Like, he perceives himself so holier than thou throughout this whole thing that he has comeuppance coming his way. And he created his own monster. Like, there's multiple points where he pushed Will Money's buttons, where he could have snapped earlier, but he didn't. And it took him killing his friend and then making a mockery of his corpse for him to, like, really snap and go back. And then I feel like maybe it's Will didn't fully leave that life behind him yet. Which is why he was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, maybe because he was still able to go back and draw upon that.
Right.
And maybe this instance finally buried it for good.
You would
And
hope.
that's why he moved off to San Francisco and left the frontier. Because, he still lives in the frontier. He still lives in the lawlessness of just out in the middle of nowhere. But then he moves to a city and picks up like this trading job or whatever. And I'm making assumptions that that whole story was true, which we don't know per se if it is true or not.
Right. Right.
But I feel like both of them kind of paralleled each other in many ways, because I feel like Bill probably was a real deal outlaw. And it was his arrogance that got in the way, though. And Will was obviously a real deal outlaw and who really needed to put that life behind him. Because my guess is like little Bill didn't need booze and all of that to push him to do the things that he did. He just did it out of his nature for control and power. Will was a really bad person who was drinking and killing and all those kinds of things, and who really tried to change his life. Because, like, did little Bill really try to leave that life behind him? He just found a different outlet, being a sheriff. So, I don't know. I think that next time I watch this movie, I think I'm going to kind of try to think about that parallel, because that's something very interesting to kind of chew on.
Yeah, and there's that line earlier in the movie when he and Ned are about to take off. I think they're still at Ned's house. I forget when this comes up during the movie, but Ned says, "You wouldn't be doing this if Claudia were still alive, wouldn't you?" So he early on in the movie, his motives are kind of getting called into question, and you get the idea that this is always a part of him, and then it really comes out by the end of the movie, driven by Bill, but you do get that sense that like you were saying, this is part of his nature, and then he becomes that unstoppable force.
Which, you know what? I appreciate that specific line and the fact that Ned's kind of pointing that out, because Will's motivations for going good aren't very strong.
Their money.
Him trying to
Oh,
be
for going good, right,
is for his wife,
right,
and not for himself. And I think that's an interesting thing, because that's such a cliche. Like in so many movies, like the woman makes the animalistic kind of rogue character go good. It's like Leia and Han Solo. It's so many of those kinds of things, and I appreciate this movie kind of calling that out, because he didn't really change. He still had that.
Kind of like he's using his wife as an excuse.
Mm-hmm. Because I feel like when it really comes down to real change, it has to be because of you. Any external reason to change yourself is using something as a crutch to try to motivate you. And like, it's interesting because like, not to go too deep into this, but like, I've written some screenplays, and one of them's very personal because like it deals with like a kid who's overweight and stuff like that. And I've put on a lot of that weight since COVID, but like I lost a lot of weight when I went to college. And it took me motivating myself and knowing that I needed to do better for myself to actually do that, trying to find that gear again. But the thing is, like in the script that I wrote, at the beginning of this story, this young man wants to lose all this weight for a girl because he doesn't think the girl's going to like him being a fat kid. But the film's really about him realizing he needs to do it for himself, because any kind of other motivation isn't good enough motivation to change.
Mhm.
Those external things only go so far. And what if you don't have those external motivations anymore? So, like Will's situation, his wife was an external catalyst for him to become a better person. But once his wife is gone, he has that opening for him to go back to his old ways. And maybe him getting up and really moving away, living a completely different life in a city and stuff, like a modern city, might be enough for him to really change. But that's the thing. We don't see Will's story past the end. We don't see Will after he rides out of that town in the pitch black rain of a night that he basically washed out that town. So, like, we'll never know, to be honest.
I'm
I do
thinking
like
of
that they don't answer it.
I'm thinking of the character of Wolverine. I know it's jumping gears a little bit, but like as you say it, I don't remember the name of the Japanese girl that he falls for in the comic, but like he changes for her, and then when she's gone, he goes back to being the rabid Wolverine again, and he was like even worse than before. So like I haven't seen Old Man Logan yet.
And she
Or-
gets turned into Lady Deathstrike.
That's right. The movie's just called Logan, right?
Yep.
Yeah, there's a
But I
similar thing going on in the Wolverine movies with that. They touch
is
on that
yeah.
in The Wolverine, right?
Well, yeah, and the thing is, it's like, this is why it would have been fascinating. Oh, I love Logan. The perfect Old Man Logan story would have been Clint Eastwood as an old Wolverine. Like, that would have been amazing. But the thing is, it's like, because the Old Man Logan comic is a Western. And 100% is based off of like Clint Eastwood and stuff like that.
That's kind of what I was thinking. It
Yeah.
is kind of a road movie, isn't it? Or a road story, at least the comics are.
Well, and I think the character of Wolverine has a lot in common with Will Money. And because he keeps trying to push that away. And I think it really is true that it's like you can't just change for something else. And once that something else is gone, what are you gonna do? It's the kind of thing where it's just like drawing even more parallels, like being an addict. Like you can't get out of like rehab, which is a completely isolated thing where it's like you have this confined place to get away from life. When you get out, you can't start going back to the same places, like, and hang out with the same people that you did stuff with, because then it's just going to trigger those things again.
Yeah. As Ewan McGregor said in was it Trainspotting?
Trainspotting.
2, the sequel. He's like, you're always an addict. Like being an addict is a part of your nature. I mean, to run with this parallel here. So like, yeah, absolutely. If we're talking about so it's about human nature, but it's also like there is agency here. Everybody has choices here. You're just making the bad choices.
They all do the wrong thing.
Right.
For most of this movie.
Yeah, that's true.
And
I gotta see the Trainspotting movies too. I didn't even know there were 2.
I really like Trainspotting too. I think that flew completely under the radar. I don't think a whole lot.
Yeah, me too.
I don't think a whole lot of people saw it. And I appreciated the approach that it took of them being middle-aged and like, dealing with the fact that like you did all these things when you were younger.
Yeah.
But yeah, what's great is this is probably one of the first times I've actually like had an at-length conversation about Unforgiven with other people. I've had a lot of like internal thoughts about this film, but this has been a really interesting conversation of like, and this is why this is a great film and why it's timeless. Like, look at all the things that you could possibly talk about it.
I feel like I could definitely watch it again and pick up on things I did not this time.
and it's written so well. The dialogue is so purposeful in terms of the themes and everything. There's some great lines and lines of dialogue in this film, and the performances are just so amazing. Like, I think Clint Eastwood gets kind of pigeonholed into one note kind of hero type, like John Wayne did. But like Clint Eastwood has a lot of acting chops in him. And I feel like this film shows a lot of range. Because if you look at him in that first scene, him falling over hogs and being like a wreck of an older man, and then you see him at the end of this film, those are two completely different people. And if you haven't seen Million Dollar Baby, I do legitimately think that's probably his best performance. Like there is some like serious emotion in that film. Which, warning everybody, it's not female Rocky. So don't
I
listen
know how
to
the
the
movie ends. I haven't seen it though.
The only thing I know about that movie is it's supposed to be really depressing. So that's why I've never watched it.
Well, because the thing is, like, the trailers made it seem like it was just like a female Rocky with Hillary Swank in it. It's not.
Well
So
done.
don't get that thought in your head.
Did he direct that one too?
Yep. And I think he got nominated for Best Director and Best Actor again.
Okay.
For that one. Clint Eastwood's never won an Academy Award for acting. But I'm trying to see if he won. I don't think he won director again. Clint Eastwood has won 4 he's won 4 Oscars. So oh no, yeah, he is a 2-time Oscar winner for directing because he did get an Oscar for Million Dollar Baby as well. And he's the lone producer on both of those films. So he won the Best Picture Oscar too. And he was nominated because American Sniper was nominated for Best Picture. Letters of Iwo Jima was nominated for Best Picture. He got nominated for Best Director for Letters of Iwo Jima. Got nominated for Best Actor in Million Dollar Baby. He got nominated for Best Picture and Best Director for Mystic River, which both lost to Lord of the Rings: Return of the King. So basically, it was actually this was his first film that he ever got nominated for awards. And since then has become like a big Oscar darling.
This might have been his first big directorial outing, right? In the public eye, at least.
He had been directing since the mid-70s.
Huh.
I think his first film was Play Misty for Me, which is an interesting thriller. But like he had some really high profile westerns that he directed, and Heartbreak Ridge, and because like he's been directing since.
I think I've heard of that one actually.
Which that's
maybe I didn't know.
That's about Grenada, I'm pretty sure. Because that was a thing. But he's been directing, and I think he said that he has one more movie. I think The Second Juror is going to be his last directorial effort, I think.
I mean, he's like 93 now, right?
Still
something
going.
Like that. He's in his 90s.
He is indeed in his 90s. And he sure has fun with his movies, like The Mule. That trailer made that seem like it was going to be the next great thriller. That movie was funny and so easygoing. He even had a moment in it where his character had sex with like 2 20-something-year-olds. I'm just like, and that's based off of a true story of like this elderly drug mule. But yeah, he has Juror number 2, and he's in it too. So still acting too, still going. But do we have any final thoughts on Unforgiven?
This is actually very unrelated, but I started looking up reviews of this while we were talking. So Jim, you might be happy to know that Roger Ebert did end up rating this 4 out of 4 stars in 2002.
Okay. So like 10-year revisitation of the movie, I guess.
Yeah, he put it on his great movies list.
Wow. Okay.
I can't find
As
the
as
92
he
review
should
though,
have.
but right.
Well,
As he should have.
I think this is I really wonder if people might have been a bit taken aback by it.
It seems like you could pick up on a lot on rewatching this movie. I do want to see it again.
It's what's interesting is with how it ends, you could just like if you're just sitting and watching this movie, you could just look at it as, yeah, he got the bad guys in the end.
Which he did, but it at what cost, right?
But the thing is, if you're just looking at it on surface level,
By becoming a bad
guys.
guy again, he gets the bad guys.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's why I didn't really like that scene in the moment. But yeah, I get it. So
It's a good way to end
just
it, I think.
it is a good way to end it.
It's a
Just
little
to
open-ended.
recap the homework here. High Plains Drifter, directed by
Clint
whom?
Eastwood.
Directed by The Beguiled, directed by
Don Siegel.
okay. And then Deadwood is one of my favorite TV shows ever. And without this movie, Deadwood is not what it is. But if anybody loves Unforgiven and they've never watched Deadwood, then like you got to do yourself a favor and check that show out.
I have to check out
I'll have to check that
the
out.
movie because I think I've watched all 3 seasons. I might have 1 season left, to be honest. But like Deadwood's some good stuff. Ian McShane throwing around cocksucker. Look at
Yeah, I mean, while we're talking about anti-heroes, right? Ian McShane's a good one in Deadwood.
It has such a great cast too. That's some peak earlier HBO from like the early 2000s.
Oh
That's
yeah,
an
I feel like
HBO.
if you polled the HBO producers at that time, this movie had to be like, everybody's in everybody's top 5.
I'll have to add that to my Max list.
Yeah, start with like the first 3 episodes are basically a mini series, and then you'll know if you're into it or not after watching the first few episodes.
It has a really good theme too.
Yeah.
It's one of those kinds of ones you don't want to skip. Like usually HBO's that. Like you don't want to skip their intros.
Yeah, good point.
HBO hasn't let me down with anything but Game of Thrones so far.
Oh.
Well, Deadwood didn't make it 8 seasons to spiral at the end. So there's that. So which I don't know how the movie was.
It was a movie?
They made an HBO original film.
Okay.
Within the past 4 years.
It was fine. It was acceptable. Yeah, it did the things it needed to do.
There you go. But
much like Will did by the end of this movie.
He needed to do it. He needed to take him out. Well, it wound up being the 3 of us. Unfortunately, Joe had too many technical difficulties to make it through. But hopefully next month we'll have the whole crew, or at least closer to the whole crew, back for the movie club. We don't know what we're doing yet, so you're just going to have to wait and find out. But Jim and Kevin, thank you. And thank all of you out there for always tuning in and supporting the Scribe Pod Development Hell Podcast. I do too many shows, and I'm going to leave that in there. And hopefully you enjoyed the discussion from the movie club.